For more than a century, the textbooks were clear. Japan was one nation, one people, one unbroken line. A civilization that rose from its own soil. No outsiders, no exceptions, no contradictions. It was one of the cleanest origin stories in modern history. But there was a problem. In the far north of the Japanese archipelago, on the island of Hokkaido, there lived a people who did not fit. A people whose faces looked, to European eyes, strangely familiar. Wavy hair, thick beards, deep-set eyes under heavy brows, skin that weathered lighter than their neighbors to the south. When 19th-century travelers encountered them, they didn't ask where these people came from. They asked something far stranger. They asked, "Are these people white?" That question would launch over 100 years of bad science, political manipulation, and systematic erasure. And the answer, when it finally arrived through ancient DNA, would overturn not just what we know about the Ainu, but what we thought we understood about race itself. The story begins in the 1870s, when Japan opened to the West and European scientists poured into the archipelago. Among them were physicians, anthropologists, and naturalists who carried with them the dominant framework of their era, the idea that all humans belonged to a handful of fixed racial categories: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, hard boundaries, clean boxes, and the Ainu presented a puzzle that would not fit. German physician Erwin Balls, working at Tokyo Imperial University, examined Ainu men and women and noted their heavy facial hair, their prominent brow ridges, their relatively light complexions. He measured skull dimensions, cataloged hair texture, photographed faces from standardized angles. His conclusion, shared by colleagues from Berlin to London to Philadelphia, was that the Ainu must be a remnant Caucasoid population, somehow stranded on the edge of Asia. The idea took hold fast. In academic journals across Europe and America, the Ainu were described as a white race marooned among Mongoloid peoples, living fossils from a lost migration. Some proposed they had walked east from the Caucasus Mountains. Others theorized a maritime route through ancient Polynesia. Each theory was different, but they all shared the same premise. These people could not possibly be East Asian. This classification was not just wrong, it was useful. Because at the same moment these papers were being published, the Meiji government was executing a very different kind of project. In 1869, Japan had unilaterally annexed Hokkaido, the Ainu homeland. The island was rebranded as a frontier, a wilderness to be settled, its indigenous inhabitants recast as primitives to be civilized. And here is where the science and the politics locked together. If the Ainu were a different race entirely, not merely a different culture, then their removal from their own lands could be framed not as conquest, but as the natural order of things. Separate peoples, separate destinies. In 1899, the Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act made it law. Ainu children were forbidden from speaking their language in schools. Those who did were punished. Communal hunting and fishing grounds, the foundation of Ainu subsistence for thousands of years, were confiscated and redistributed to Japanese settlers who poured into Hokkaido under government-sponsored colonization programs. Traditional tattoos, ceremonies, and religious practices were banned or driven underground. Ainu were reclassified as former Aborigines, a label designed to imply that their identity was already past tense, already over. Within a single generation, an entire way of life was dismantled, and the people themselves were expected to vanish into the Japanese mainstream, as if they had never existed. And through it all, the racial classification held. The Ainu were different, not Japanese. The science said so. The beards proved it. The brow ridges confirmed it. But the science was built on a flaw so fundamental that it would take a century to expose. And the crack began not in a genetics lab, but in the soil. For decades, archaeologists had been excavating Jomon sites across the Japanese islands. The Jomon culture, named for the distinctive cord-marked pottery it produced, represented one of the oldest continuous ceramic traditions on Earth, stretching back at least 16,000 years. Jomon people were hunter-gatherer fishers who built permanent settlements, constructed elaborate pit houses, traded obsidian across hundreds of kilometers, and developed some of the earliest evidence of plant cultivation in East Asia. Their pottery alone spans roughly 10,000 years of continuous stylistic evolution. No comparable unbroken tradition exists anywhere. The skeletal remains told a consistent story. Jomon skulls had robust features, pronounced brow ridges, wider nasal bridges, deeper eye orbits, shorter and broader faces. They looked, in other words, a great deal like the Ainu. This connection had been noted as early as the 1950s by Japanese physical anthropologists. But under the prevailing racial framework, it led nowhere useful. If Jomon people looked Caucasoid and Ainu looked Caucasoid, the assumption was simply that both groups must have some ancient European connection. The framework absorbed the evidence without changing. New data poured into old categories, and the categories held. What nobody asked, because the framework made the question invisible, was whether the features themselves might mean something different from what European scientists assumed. Whether deep-set eyes and heavy brows were not markers of European origin at all, but markers of something far older. Something that preceded the modern categories entirely. What if the Ainu were not transplants from somewhere else, but survivors of something that had once been everywhere? That question would not be asked until the tools existed to answer it, and those tools did not arrive until the 21st century. If you're finding this story as compelling as we think it is, subscribe so you don't miss the stories we publish next. Because what the DNA revealed changes everything. In 2012, a team of Japanese geneticists published a landmark study analyzing genome-wide SNP data from over 7,000 individuals across the Japanese archipelago, alongside comparative data from Chinese, Korean, and other East Asian populations. The results showed something that the bones alone could never prove. The Ainu and the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa, separated by more than 2,000 kilometers of ocean, clustered together genetically and away from mainland Japanese. Both groups carried a significantly higher proportion of ancient Jomon ancestry. This confirmed the core of a model proposed in 1991 by physical anthropologist Kazuto Hanihara, the dual structure hypothesis. In this model, modern Japanese populations formed from two ancestral streams: the indigenous Jomon, who had occupied the islands for over 14,000 years, and a wave of continental migrants who arrived during the Yayoi period, roughly 3,000 years ago, bringing wet rice agriculture from the Korean peninsula and Northeast Asia. As the Yayoi population expanded, Jomon ancestry was diluted across most of the archipelago. Only at the geographic margins, in Hokkaido to the north and Okinawa to the south, did substantial Jomon ancestry persist. Two waves, two populations, one clean story. But was it clean enough? But Hanihara's model was about to be updated. In 2021, a team led by researchers at Trinity College Dublin and the Riken Center for Integrative Medical Sciences published a study in Science Advances that added a stunning new layer. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from 12 skeletal remains spanning pre-farming and post-farming periods across the archipelago, they were able to track genetic shifts through time in a way that modern DNA alone could never accomplish. And they discovered that the story of Japan was not 2 migrations, it was 3. The third wave arrived during the Kofun period, roughly 300 to 700 CE, the era of massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds and the consolidation of the Yamato state. This third ancestral component carried East Asian ancestry distinct from the Yayoi contribution. It reshaped the genetic landscape of mainland Japan in ways the dual model had never predicted. And here is the finding that rewrites the Ainu story entirely. The Jomon population, from whom the Ainu descend most directly, diverged from continental East Asian populations between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago. That is the period when rising sea levels severed the land bridges connecting Japan to the mainland, isolating the island population. For millennia afterward, the Jomon maintained an effective population size of approximately 1,000 individuals, a small, stable group evolving in near-total genetic isolation. The traits that 19th-century Europeans read as Caucasoid, the robust brows, the deeper eye sockets, the body hair, are not European features at all. They are ancestral features. They belong to an ancient East Asian population that diverged before the suite of physical characteristics now commonly associated with modern East Asian appearance became widespread across the continent. The Ainu don't look European because they came from Europe. They look different from their neighbors because they stayed, while the continent around them changed. This is what the racial framework could never see. It assumed that certain physical features belonged to certain continents, that brow ridges meant Europe, that straight hair meant Asia. But human variation does not organize itself by continent. It organizes itself by time. The Ainu carry the face of Deep Asia, a face that predates the categories we invented to describe it. What the evidence shows is precise and measurable. Genome-wide analysis places the Ainu as the population with the highest proportion of Jomon ancestry among any living group. What this rules out is the century-long Caucasoid hypothesis, conclusively. There is no European genetic signal in the Ainu genome. None. The physical resemblance that launched 100 papers was a coincidence of convergent retention, not a fingerprint of shared descent. And what this implies is that an entire population was misclassified, dispossessed, and nearly erased based on a framework that could not distinguish between ancestry and appearance. The damage of that framework was not abstract. It was written into law. For nearly a century after the 1899 Act, the Ainu existed in a legal and cultural limbo. Their language, a language isolate with no known relatives anywhere on Earth, was driven to the edge of extinction. Today, fewer than 10 fluent native speakers remain. Their population, once spread across Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, was compressed, relocated, and systematically undercounted. The most recent government survey, from 2023, records just 11,450 Ainu in Hokkaido. Researchers believe the actual number is far higher, because generations of stigma have made many Ainu reluctant to identify themselves. It was not until 2008 that Japan officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people, not until 2019 that the Ainu Promotion Act passed into law, and not until 2020 that the Upapoi National Ainu Museum opened in Shiraoi, Hokkaido, the first national institution dedicated to Ainu history and culture. But the debate is far from settled. Some scholars argue the tripartite model is still too simple, that the genetic history of the archipelago involves more complex patterns of admixture, backmigration, and regional variation than any three-wave model can capture. Others point out that genetic ancestry and cultural identity are not the same thing, that calling the Ainu descendants of the Jomon risks reducing a living people to an archaeological category, freezing them in a past they did not choose. The Ainu themselves have expressed complex and sometimes conflicting views on how genetics should relate to their political and cultural claims. Some welcome the science as validation. Others worry it replaces one form of external classification with another. And there remain genuine unknowns that future research must confront. The Jomon period lasted more than 14,000 years. Were the Jomon themselves a single, genetically homogeneous population, or did they contain internal diversity that current ancient DNA sampling, still remarkably sparse, cannot yet resolve? The 12 genomes in the 2021 study span enormous stretches of time and geography. Each one is a single data point from a millennium. More sampling could confirm the tripartite model, refine it, or complicate it beyond recognition. There is also the question of Okhotsk culture, a maritime people who inhabited parts of northern Hokkaido and Sakhalin between the 5th and 13th centuries, whose genetic contribution to the Ainu remains only partially understood. What is no longer in question is this: the 19th century classification was wrong. The framework that called the Ainu white was not science. It was a story told by one civilization about another, using categories that said more about the storytellers than the people they described. Today, in a museum in Shiraoi, traditional Ainu robes hang behind glass. The patterns are unmistakable, spiraling designs meant to ward off evil spirits from entering the body at its openings, wrists, neck, hem. Those designs are unique in the world. No European parallel. No continental Asian equivalent. They belong to a people who spent 15,000 years developing a civilization on an island at the edge of the Pacific, and who are still here despite every effort to make them disappear. If this hidden chapter of history surprised you, subscribe to explore more stories the evidence is only now bringing to light. The Ainu language has no known relative anywhere on Earth. If it disappears, an entire branch of human expression vanishes with it, and with fewer than 10 speakers left, the question is not whether we should care, but whether we are already too late.